want answers!
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Can you handle the truth? Well, whether you can or not, it's time I told you the truth. The truth is that Greek, although it's very regular, has its own set of oddities. Now we've seen that English is that way, but if along the way I've implied that Greek is like this mechanical language that's perfect and never does anything strange, well, I haven't been telling you the truth. Because the truth is that language is a product of humanity. And if you haven't figured it out yet, humanity is twisted, okay? And so language, human language, it's not like it's spit out of a computer. It's a very twisted sort of, it has a lot of irregularities and odd features. Well, this is true of Greek as well. Now, compared to English, Greek is very regular, much more regular. It makes a lot more sense. It's a much more beautiful language than English. But let me share an analogy with you. One of my favorite places in all of the world is Point Reyes. We honeymooned there, and I just love it. It's out on the coast of California. And if I have a little time when I'm going down to teach seminary or something, I always try to work in an overnighter to Point Reyes. There are these places you can backpack in. I love the ocean views, but what I like most of all are the trees. And I love the trees because they are so twisted. It's this lush place where these trees have grown in all these weird shapes and angles. And I just go around, you know, like walking around looking at the trees because they're so fascinating. Well, you might think of a verb as a sort of tree. You know, there are various types and they can be classified and all, but you really don't know a verb until you've looked at it in all of its twistedness. Now, there's a very clear way that Greek verbs can be classified and their twistedness can be studied. It is called principal parts. And by looking at the six stems that break off of the root of the verb, you look at how it breaks off in these 6 different directions, you can understand a Greek verb in all of its twistedness. And you can despise this and you can say, I wish this was a Christmas tree farm and that every tree looked exactly alike, but wouldn't that be dull? No, Greek is much more interesting than that, and in fact each verb has its own little idiosyncrasies, and so to understand a verb fully, you have to really have a clue as to its 6 principal parts. It all starts with the root. Okay, so the root is the most basic form of the verb. Okay, and from that root, it grows up and 6 stems break off. Now, they're always listed in a certain order. Now, the beauty is that once you know these 6 stems, you know how the verb will behave in all of its hundreds of forms. Okay, now here are the 6 stems that we have to learn. The present, that'll be number 1. Number 2 will be the future. Number 3 will be the aorist. Number 4, the perfect active. Number 5, the perfect middle passive. And number 6, the aorist passive. Once you know these 6 tense stems, you understand the verb. And they're always listed in that order. Now, don't freak out because most of these are very regular. And we've already seen that the present tense stem is the one that you learn when you learn the word, right? Because the lexicon always lists the present active indicative. The future, we know the clue, usually a sigma, right, before the primary endings. The aorist, we're used to the augment and the sigma alpha. The perfect has the reduplication and the kappa, right, or in the middle passive, the endings tacked on without any connecting vowels. And then the aorist passive has theta eta. Now what we'll see is that these stems, when they break off, they almost always follow those patterns. So it's not as hard as it might sound. But we have seen that there are some oddballs, right? So like we've looked at liquid aorists, which drop sigmas after lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Okay, well we looked at that. That's just a quirk of this liquid future and the liquid aorist. It's just a different form that happens after lambda, mu, nu, and rho. And we've also seen a second aorist. What's the quirk of the second aorist? It changes its tense stem. And it doesn't use sigma alpha, right? So it winds up looking like an imperfect. We've also seen another odd twisted fellow, the deponent. And the deponent, remember, is middle passive in form but active in meaning. So we've seen that. So there are a few twisted fellows, but there aren't hundreds of them. In fact, I'll just show you one more after this lesson and we're done. That's it. So it's not as hard as it may sound. It's sort of like you're walking through the forest and you see the birch tree and the oak tree and the maple tree, and you learn to recognize these trees, understanding that any individual oak tree may look slightly different than some other oak tree, but basically an oak tree has some very recognizable qualities. So that's how we're going to attack verbs, and I think you'll see that once we learn to see these patterns, verbs really are not as difficult as sometimes we pretend like they are. We Greek teachers like to make it seem like it's hard just to make us feel smart, but frankly, we can figure this out.
All right, well, let's look at our old friend luo, and let's look at this root and stems. Now, we've already looked at all of this before, so nothing new here, but just to think of it in this grid of root and stems, okay, that's what I want you to get in your head. The point is that if you knew these 6 forms, then you could deduce all of the rest of them, at least pretty close, okay? So the present tense stem is regular. It's just the present tense stem and the primary endings, so luo. And then we get luo, lues, lue, etc. And then the middle passive, lu amai, lue, luetai, etc. Now, the imperfect is actually not a tense stem. It's built off of a tense stem, okay? So we know to get the imperfect, we just add an augment to the present tense stem and the secondary endings. So that's how we get the imperfect. But the imperfect is not listed here as a tense stem. It's built off of the present tense stem, okay? Now the future tense stem, just exactly what we've come to expect from our old friend here, luo, is that it adds a sigma before the primary endings. So luso, luses, luce, and in the middle here, lusamai, luce, etc. So future is luso. For the aorist, we augment and use sigma alpha. And can you see how if you just had this form and you knew that was the aorist active form, you would go, oh, perfectly regular, elusa, elusas, elusin, and then in the middle, elusamain, eluso, elusata, etc. So with that tense stem, you can build the aorist, active and middle here. The perfect active tense stem is also regular, of course. We have a reduplication and a kappa with an alpha. So lelu ka, kas ken, common kata kasi. So if we had this form, we could say, okay, regular here. The perfect middle passive, also reduplication, and then with the middle passive endings with no connecting vowel. So lelu mai, sai, tai, methas, the ntai, etc. Okay, so what I'm saying here is these are the 6 key forms. Let's look at the last one here, the aorist passive tense stem. Well, we have an augment, of course, because we're in the aorist, and the theta eta. So it follows all the rules. Eluthane, thes, they, thame, and theta, thesan. So you can see the aorist passive. Now, the future passive is sort of like the imperfect up here, in that it's built off of a tense stem. There is no future passive tense stem. The future passive is built on the aorist passive, and you can see it adds a sigma after the theta eta, and then uses the primary middle passive endings, which sort of makes sense. So that's it for luo. Luo is a perfectly regular root on perfectly regular stems. I mean, if we were doing a verb farm here and wanted nice, neat rows and everything to work perfectly, luo would be our verb. Now let's look at a verb that's a little more twisted, shall we say. Twisted a little bit, but not horribly twisted. This one still makes quite a bit of sense, actually. Okay, so we have our present tense stem. And by the way, obviously this is a slightly different picture, but the forms that are highlighted are the principal parts, okay? So in the present, it's apostello. You can see that it added a lambda to the sim. Why? Well, because the present is often the strangest of the stems. You'll notice that none of the other tense stems double up the lambda, only the present. So in many cases, the present will be the odd man out. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. We have our primary endings, and then in the middle passives, amai. Now, the imperfect, right, built off the present will be an augment and the secondary endings. Where is the augment? Between the preposition and the verb. And notice that in this case, apa became op-e. The omicron just turned into an epsilon. Okay. The future, where is the sigma? Apostolo, liquid future. See the circumflex, see the liquid, lambda mu newer rho, right? No sigma. In the liquid aorist here, well, I kind of gave that away, didn't I? Why no sigma? It's a liquid also, of course. Noticed here that we have, again, the augment is op-e instead of op-a. The omicron became an epsilon. We also have seen in the liquid forms that often stem vowels will change a little bit on us, but no big deal. We can handle it, right? All right. So op-estela, so it's a liquid aorist. The perfect has a reduplication and a kappa. Well, the reduplication here is hidden between the preposition and the verb, and in this case it looks just like an augment. But that's not an augment, that's called a vocalic reduplication. You do it with your, not by repeating any consonant, because there's no consonant to repeat here, so you actually just change or augment the vowel, which looks, I'm sorry, but exactly like an augment. But this is actually a reduplication. It's showing you that this is perfect. That wouldn't help you much, but you get the kappa alpha right here. So that saves the day, doesn't it? Okay. Apestal ka. And then the perfect middle passive, apestal mai. Again, the vocalic reduplication. And then we have no connecting vowel there, so just apestal, not amai, but just mai. It's tacked right on. That's the normal form of the perfect middle passive. The second aorist passive, we have the augment apestal ain. Now, this is a second aorist passive. Why? Because there's no theta here. Anytime an aorist drops the theta and only uses an eta, that's called a second aorist. It only happens on rare occasions. It's not a big deal. In general, second forms on the right side of the tree here just involve dropping a letter. So, for example, a second perfect just doesn't use the kappa, and a second aorist passive here just doesn't use the theta. We'll see later that a second future passive, well, let's just see it right now. It doesn't use the theta either. Okay, so these are both seconds. Okay, so that one's a little bit weird. We might have been tempted to say apestal thane, but the theta goes away. So that's a second aorist passive. Okay, so do you get it? If you had these 6 forms, you could make all the other forms. That's the deal with the principal parts. Apostello is a little twisted. Ballo is even more twisted, okay? Ballo means I throw, right? Okay, so the root of ballo is ball, beta, alpha, lambda, just like that. So in the present, just like apostello, we see that the lambda doubles. Okay, we're getting used to that. The present can be a little strange that way. But there it is with the primary endings. In the imperfect, we augment and use secondary endings. Built, see, on the present tense stem, the ball with the double lambda is still there. Please notice that in all the rest, well, there's no double lambdas anyway. At least it's not like the present. We'll get to some of the weirdos here in just a second. Okay. Now the liquid future makes sense. It's a lambda. So when you have a lambda mu newer rho, you drop the sigma and you'll see that circumflex floating on the top there. Happens in the middle as well. In the second aorist here, well, we have ebalon. Now what happened here? We went from a double lambda to a single lambda, and so it's that simple. So we augment, we have the morphed stem of the verb, and we then use the secondary endings. But there's no sigma alpha, and you'll notice that it looks just like the imperfect, except there's only one lambda, right? Okay, so that's the second aorist. And please notice you can have a verb here like ballo that has a liquid future and a second aorist. How obnoxious of it, but it does, okay? That's why you really need to understand all 6 tense stems to really know the verb inside out. All right, the perfect active is, okay, the reduplication looks good, beble, but what happened to beta alpha lambda? Where did the alpha go? And why the eta? Well, here's an example of twistedness. It just is, okay? And we have to sort of get used to this idea that vowels can do weird things like disappear, or in this case, insert themselves before the endings, beble ka. But if you could think of balo as beta lambda and then some vowels, okay, then it would help you. So beble ka, I have thrown. The perfect middle passive also uses ble as the stem here, beble mai, not amai. Notice no connecting vowel. The aorist passive, we have an augment and a theta eta, eble thane, which makes perfect sense. And then the future passive, no augment, of course, theta eta sigma, and then the primary middle passive ending, ble thesamai. Okay, so balo is a little weird, but I think if you were looking, reading along, and you saw beble ka, boy, that ought to scream perfect to you, right? Reduplication, kappa, and hopefully, well, what's that? You might have to look it up. But it's from balo, and maybe you would hear it, beble ka. So anyway, the clues are there. Augment, theta eta, liquid form there. Well, wait, that's not a liquid, that's a second aorist. And the clue there is no sigma alpha. You've got an augment, no sigma alpha, and a stem change. Here you have the liquid consonant, no sigma, and then you have the circumflex floating over the sometimes strange looking vowel endings. The present is and imperfect are normal. So in other words, the clues are consistent, okay? Even in these twisted forms, the things that are regular even in the twisted forms, okay? You have some little odd idiosyncrasies, but you have to learn how to sort of roll with those punches and see the important clues. And with those important clues, well, you can tell the oak from the birch from the maple, okay? So that's what we're going to be learning how to do. One of the vocabulary handouts I have for you is a list of the principal parts of every verb in the New Testament used more than 50 times. I know, it's a lot, but it's really sort of interesting to look at these, especially to look down the columns and to see what the patterns are. And you can start to see, you know, like the big shapes, okay? So, for example, just looking down the present column for starters here. Notice, okay, agapao, and you can see that I've shaded the boxes depending on what kind of verb it is. So we have contract verbs they are green shaded, second aorists are red, liquid verbs are blue for like water, I thought, okay. Deponents are yellow, and me verbs, which we haven't yet met, are orange. But okay, agapao, a contract. And the normal verbs you can see are just omegas. Okay, here's a me verb, which we'll get to later. Now here are a couple of our deponents, ap erchamai and apakrenamai. Notice they're amai endings. Most of them end in omega, or they end in the mais, or if it's a contract verb, then we have the vowel and then the omega ending. So that's pretty much it for the presents. Now let's take a look at the futures. Okay, sigma, right? Sigma before the omega. Here we have the sigma buried in the C. Here's a liquid future, so there is no sigma, but there's our rho. Makes sense? Here's another contract verb, so there's our sigma omega, and before the tense formative, the sigma, the vowel lengthens, so I taste so. It's all so beautifully regular. Here we have a future deponent. Anabesamai means I will go up. Not will I will be gone up or something. Doesn't, again, even make sense. Okay, so that's the futures. The aorists, notice that they end in sigma alpha pretty consistently, unless they are either a liquid aorist, in which case the sigma drops before the rho here, or if it's a second aorist, in which case you just have the on ending because it's the secondary endings. This one's a little odd, but most of them end in on. You can see if they're seconds. And let's see, slide on down. There is such a thing as aorist deponents. So some of them are, you can see that middle passive ending. Actually, in this case, it's a middle ending, just middle. Amen. But still sigma alpha, samen, samen. So look at the patterns in the aorists. The perfects, we have our reduplication. And again, the reduplication may look like an augment like it does here, kappa alpha. Unless it's a second aorist, in which case there's no kappa. It drops the kappa. Let me look at it. See, no kappa, no kappa. But most of the times, the perfect will have kappa alpha. That's our clue for the perfect. Perfect middle passive have the my endings with the augment. And the aorist passives have the theta eta. Unless it happens to be, you can see most of them are first aorists, but some of them don't have a theta. That's called a second aorist passive, and that's all there is to that. But anyway, take some time and just look down the columns and look for the patterns. And remember, look for contract verbs and how they behave. Look at the second aorists. Look at the liquid verbs and how they behave. The deponents. And then, well, after next lesson, you'll be looking also at the me verbs. And I think you'll find this chart to be very helpful as you try to understand the major shapes of verbs in the Greek language. Okay, to the wild, the best place to encounter the verbs. And I want to show you how we will recognize clues here. So here we are in John 20, and go ahead and read with me if you can. Te, de, mia, ton, sabaton. On the first day of the week, Maria he Magdalene, Maria Magdalene, right? Erchetai, okay, here we go. Here's our first verb. Now, what's erchetai? What's the lexical form? That's a middle passive ending, right? But it's from, come on, erchomai, right? So this is, please say the word, deponent. So Mary Magdalene comes. Now you'll notice this is translated past, came, but it's actually a present tense verb. So what are they doing here? Well, it's called a historic present. Sometime in Greek, as well as in English, we tell a story that happened in the past, but we'll put it in present tense to make it more vivid. So I'm coming into my house and I'm carrying my computer and a banana and I drop them both on the floor. You see, I'm telling the story as if it's present even though it's in the past. That's what's happening here. John is saying, okay, so it's the first day of the week and Mary comes early in the morning while it's still dark to the tomb. Kai, blepe. Okay, now what do you, just even if you don't know that word, blepe, what does that look? Is there an augment? No. And that looks like the normal, the primary endings, primary active endings, and it sure enough is. So she sees the stone. Notice they're still translating it past tense, but it's actually present tense. She sees the stone. Erminon, that's a participle, so don't worry about it. Taken from the tomb. Here we have treche. Same thing. Any augment? No. Anything look, trecho becomes treche, so she runs. Present, active indicative, third person singular. She runs, and here we go again. Erchetai, she comes to Simon Peter. Pros, Simona, Petron, Kai, Pros, Ton, Alon, Mathetain, Han, Ephile, Ha, Jesus. So she comes to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved. Now this is an interesting one. What's going on with this? Do you remember the lexical form of this? Ephile. What does it look like? Well, we see an augment there, so we know it's got to be like an aorist or an imperfect. Does this look like a present tense stem? Let's look it up. Sure enough, it does. Phil, and here it is, Phil. So it's an augmented present tense. Now, what happened here is we had a combination, we had a vowel contraction, but that's the third person singular secondary ending. And what's interesting about this is that, okay, so she comes to Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved. Really, this is an imperfect. It should be translated was loving, which is horrible English. But John is communicating not just that Jesus loved him as just a single event, but that was an ongoing state of affairs, whom Jesus was loving. Isn't that cool? Okay, and lege, she says, from Lego, right? So this is just our nice third person singular ending. Lego, leges, lege. She says, again, they're still going past, but she says to them, to Peter and John, Aaron ton kurion, ek tu nemeu. They took the Lord out of the tomb. Now, Aaron, what's this one? Get extra points if you can conjure up the lexical form of Aaron. It's from Iro. Now, how would you know that? Well, it would be hard to see that because it is in fact, the I became an A here because of the augment. And then we have the third person plural ending because this is a liquid aorist. So it's a little hard to see here. But it's just a aorist active indicative third person plural. They took the Lord from the tomb and not oidamen, even if we don't know oida. The amen looks first person plural, right? We don't know where ethekon, that's a me verb, we'll get to that later. We don't know where they put him. Ex eilthen un ha petras. Ex eilthen. Oh, can anyone tell me what the lexical form of ex eilthen is? Ex erchamai, right? Because what is this? A second aorist. And as I've warned you, erchamai is a very common word in Greek, and so is its aorist form, eilthen. So ex is out, so ex eilthen. Peter went out, and the other disciple, and erchanta. Oh, here we go again. Erchanta. What's that from? Erchamai. Now this is, you'll notice that erchanta is a secondary middle passive ending, and we've got this augment. So erchamai became erchanta. Okay, the epsilon augmented to an eta, and then we put it in the past. Here we have it's imperfect, so it's ongoing in the past. So Peter and the other disciple were going erchanta eis ta nemeon, to the tomb. Here we go. What about this one? We saw before, trecho, remember, means I run. So what is etrechon? Well, augment, present tense stem, secondary endings. Okay, so that's an imperfect. So they were running, the two together. So here's our subject, nominative case. The two together were running. And the other disciple, praedramen. Okay, here's a weird one. This is really a weird one. It's trecho. But you'll see that it's a second aorist here. Praedramon becomes praedramen. It's a third person singular, but it's in second aorist. So this is a bit of an oddball there. Okay, so the other disciple ran faster than Peter, and here we go, eilthen. Oh, please tell me you know the lexical form of eilthen. He came, right? It's erchamai. It's that second aorist form of erchamai. So erchamai, when it goes into the second or into the past, doesn't use sigma alpha. It changes its stem and uses secondary endings. So this is third person singular, eilthen. So Peter came first to the tomb, eis ta nemeon, kai parakupsas, a participle, blepe, from blepo, right? So blepe, he sees lying there, ta athania, strips of linen, not mentoi, eis eilthan. But he did not, though, eis eilthan. There we go again, eis eilthan from eis erchamai, right? Okay, eis eilthan, he didn't go in. And here we go, erchatai, he shirit, comes. So erchamai, are you like about to believe me that erchamai and eilthon are important verbs to know? Okay, all right. So anyway, the point is that as we've gone through these roots and stems, we've seen patterns that will help us. And we'll learn to recognize those patterns. And we'll learn to savor each verb in all of its wildness and complexity.
You can't handle the truth.
Yes, we can handle the truth. I've introduced you in this lesson to the wildness of the Greek verb. But I hope you see that there are certain patterns that are really quite recognizable, very recognizable. In fact, it's sort of like, again, learning names of trees. So we learn to recognize the characteristics of the maple and the birch and the oak tree, and we see the patterns, right? It's an amazing forest, though. It's not like a Christmas tree farm. It's not just like these are cranked out by a machine. Greek verbs are cranked out by the human mind, just as all language is, which means it's a little twisted, which also means it's really quite stunningly beautiful. And we have time to wander through this forest and begin to acquaint ourselves with all the consistencies and inconsistencies and beautiful twistedness of the Greek verb.